Hey everyone, if you're just joining us, we're gonna get ready to start in about 1 minute. We're waiting for everyone to join us, so welcome. Again, David has just gotten his first whiskey of the night, so he's fully ready for the Brains in the Bar format. I hope that you have your drink of choice. You just drink it neat, no ice cubes or anything?
If I ever see anyone put ice in a single malt Scottish whiskey, they will hear from me in no uncertain terms.
Good to know. I'm going to keep that in mind.
You can put water in, a little bit of water to bring out the volatiles at room temperature, but do not. I've seen people, friends of mine, jump into the glass and grab the ice cube out and suck it dry. So it's
amazing. All right. Well,
we're very snobby. We shouldn't have started on the whiskey theme. I'm getting questions about how much I drink. Oops.
So many opinions.
So Ken, just the one. I've got to teach tomorrow.
All right. Well, let us go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody. Welcome to the Association of Rice Alumni's Brains in a Bar with David Alexander. We've already been talking about whiskey, but I hope that you've poured yourself your favorite drink, whatever it is, and you're ready to learn about the changing face of space. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know a few things. If you have a question, feel free to add it to the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and those will be answered at the end of the presentation during the Q&A section. However, if you have a super pertinent question during the presentation, use the raise your hand feature and David will be happy to answer that. So without further ado, I want to welcome David Alexander. He's a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, where his primary areas of research are solar physics, exoplanetary physics, and Earth remote sensing. He also serves as the director of the Rice Space Institute. So welcome, David. We're so glad you could be here tonight.
Well, thank you. I'd like to say that it was the first time I've given a talk while drinking, but that would be a lie. Well, thanks for joining us. And I know it's a busy week and there's a lot of stuff to choose from. And so I appreciate you all being here. I hope, maybe not all of you, but I hope some of you were at the lunchtime event at 1 o'clock with Administrator Bridenstine. You know, I think it's great. He's been, I didn't want to praise him too much, but I think he has been a really great asset to NASA. I mean, there were some concerns when he came from the political side, and that was always a worry. But if you'd listen to some of his speeches, forget the politics side of things, but if you'd listen to some of his speeches and what he said about NASA and so on, I think it was good having someone come in with that passion for NASA and with a little bit of nous when it comes to dealing with Congress, because I think that, and he pointed to that today, that's been the biggest challenge when either different Congress sessions or different administrations at the presidential level have come in. Nobody wants to defund or stop supporting NASA, but they do tend to put in their own ideas, and it just basically means kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back approach. So I think he's been actually really quite good. And as I said earlier too, if you were there, you know, he doesn't just say, hey, I'm the boss and people tell me things. He actually knows what's going on. He knows something about the science of what's happening. And so anyway, so that was good. So what I'm hoping to do tonight is I'll touch on that a little bit. He didn't get a chance to mention the Artemis Accords, and I'll come to that at the end. So I'm going to be dabbling a little bit in different areas, and no pun intended, but space is really big. And so there's many, many different avenues. When I've given talks like this before, for example, I could be talking about some of the science that we do. I chose tonight, in part because the administrator was talking today, to give a kind of broad sweep of what's happening in space exploration, not so much on the science side, but on the sense of the exploration side, and how it's connected to commercial. I'll touch a little bit with international, and I'll try and stick a little bit to a Houston theme for the most part. And I know some of you who may have taken my Back to the Moon class will have heard me speak about some of these issues. So again, feel free to criticize me, argue with me, disagree with me. And as Kate said, I think if you do, I'd rather you kind of, if we were actually in a bar and we're doing this, we'd be able to have a much kind of clearer conversation where we can actually talk about topics as they come up. It's a little bit difficult, a little bit more difficult in this format. But please, if you have a question, and because I'm doing a couple of little subtopics, if you have a question at the time, just use the feature about raising your hand, and either I or Kate or Amanda will catch it. And I do not mind one bit from being interrupted. And what I'll do is I'll unmute you to ask your questions so that it's not just my voice the whole time. So anyway, with that, let me just, what I'm going to do is start a little bit. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to the Space Institute, not too much, and what we're trying to do within Houston and what's been going on in the conversation. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about our students, because I think that's one of the key things that we should be focusing on in a way, not just our own students at Rice, which of course is our main mission, but also the role that the next generation will have to play going forward. And I think we've been really lucky with the quality and the leadership of our students at Rice in particular, and that's been a growth area in the last couple of years, and I'll mention some names a little bit later. It is our 20th anniversary for the Rice Space Institute. It was created when the physics department merged with space physics and astronomy, and the chair of space physics and astronomy at the time was Professor Patricia Reif, and as part of the merger, she created the Rice Space Institute. And so I kind of took over the role as director in 2012, and we were going to have a big celebration for our 20th anniversary, but we had a small thing called a pandemic. So what we're hoping to do, sticking to the whiskey theme, is we're hoping if things open up a little bit, although it's not looking great, sometime in 2021, probably now the fall, we'll have a Rice Space Institute turns 21 party. And so then hopefully we'll have some, we'll be able to have a favorite libation at that. So again, sticking with the brains in a bar theme. As I said, it's better than being brained in a bar, which if you're from Glasgow, you'll probably know what that means. Okay, so let's see if I can make this go forward. So just very briefly, one of the kind of things that we're trying to do, I see my job as the director of the Space Institute is having two kind of directions, in and out. Coming into campus, the idea is to try and get our faculty, our researchers, our students much more interested in space. We do a lot of really, really cool things at Rice in terms of scientific research, technology development, and so on. Even in the social sciences and humanities, there's a number of areas that are touching in on the space front. So the idea there is to get our community more aware of what space and what the space development is looking for. I think people have their own mindset on what space is. For instance, if you're in Houston, it's about rockets and astronauts. If you're in Scotland, it's about data from small sats and applying data to agriculture and fishing and so on. And so there's a wide range of activities that a lot of the work that we do in our biosciences, in our material sciences, in our robotics, in our astrophysics and so on, have a direct application. So what I try and do is get our faculty interested in the potential space applications of their work, and then help them try and make those connections to NASA, to space industry, to maybe get some of those research funds and so on. And if I have time a little bit later, I can tell you one of the success stories that we've had. The other thing is outward, and that's to let people be much more aware of Rice when it comes to space. We get associated with space research primarily because we're in Houston and because that's where the Johnson Space Center is. But we don't get real, and somebody pointed out today, actually, I hadn't really followed this, that there's a new category, or a fairly recent category in US News report in space science. And Rice is ranked really, really low on that. It's like 211 or 213 or something. Now, I haven't looked to see how they define those categories and so on, but obviously that's a good thing for me to look at and see if we can get from 213 to 210 or even higher, and start looking at how we might better. I think we've got programs that identify with those activities, and maybe they're just not being captured, or I need to look at why that is and what we can do to improve that. So make people more aware of what's happening at Rice and bring in that external work, and then let people at Rice know that they have a contribution to make. I was telling Kate before everyone came on that I gave a talk in Scotland recently to a software conference of all things. And I basically told them that whether they know it or not, they're all actually space industries. Because in order to put people in space, in order to put satellites and other resources in space, requires a whole range of different technologies, from medical technologies if you're dealing with astronauts, to sustainable technologies if you're also dealing with astronauts, but for power and water reclamation and so on, all the way through to advanced materials to mitigate radiation effects, avionics and control systems, how you handle data, how you control cybersecurity type issues for safe communications. All those things require innovation and advances in many, many different fields. So in a broader scope, that's what we're trying to do with the Space Institute. And then I guess one other thing is that last bullet. We try and work very closely. Rice is proud member of the Houston community. And so we try and work with a lot of the other entities in Houston, and I'll be mentioning a few of those as we go forward. So one of the things, and again, this is something I could give a half-hour talk on, and I'm not going to. One of the things that we see a lot of value in, and particularly for Houston, but also in connecting to places around the world, is not just what do you do in a given sector, but how do you connect the sectors? How do you take innovation in one discipline and move it across? And in Houston, we're very fortunate that we have obviously the space industry. We're home to the premier center for human space exploration. We are known as the global energy capital of the world. And of course, we have the world's largest medical center. So these are all high-tech, innovative industries. And in many cases, we're solving a lot of the same problems, or sort of related problems. Some of you may have heard of pumps and pipes, for example. And so the idea is, and I see that there's maybe a question I'll go to in a second. So the idea is to look for that and look for where those overlaps, those synergies are, get those people together, create the fora within which we can have these different people talk, so that we're not reinventing the wheel when we know that maybe someone down the street or someone up at I-10 has solved the problem for us. And then once you do that within Houston, you create this ecosystem here that can be expanded for the rest of the world. So let me just check this. So one question from Mike Ross is about how many undergraduate space science majors are there in each class, and how many grad students? So that's a really good question, and it's a painful one. I think graduate students, I think overall we're in the 30 to 50. We've got a strong, and that's in space sciences, and we have three disciplines: space physics, astronomy, and astrophysics, and then I'm SOAR, which counts as under space physics. So we have maybe 10 faculty, but we have about 50 or so graduate students. Our undergraduate population in the space sciences side is small. I mean, probably in the single digits, probably even less than 5. And if you include astronomy, it might go up to 6 or 7. We really, really need to work to improve that. Oh, and Mike, I'm sorry, I was supposed to let you ask your own question. So my bad, but I'll open it up in case you have a response. But the key thing is that it's a small program. I think it's quite an impactful program, and we need to grow it. And not only do we need to grow it in terms of numbers, we need to grow it in terms of inclusion and diversity, because we are very we're very kind of one form. So Mike, I'm going to let you talk in case I have either miss, where's my cursor? Okay, I can't seem to click that button. Can you, because I'm on display mode, can you allow Mike Ross to, just allow Mike Ross to talk?
So he didn't raise his hand. He just put it in the Q&A. So he doesn't want to talk. If he raises
Okay.
his hand, then he wants to talk. But if it's just in the Q&A, then don't worry. You did everything right, David. No worries.
Okay. So, but what I just learned there was that I cannot unmute someone when I'm in display mode because my cursor is jumping all over the place.
Okay.
So maybe you could do that for me.
For sure.
All right. Thank you. So sorry about that. I hope that answered your question, Mike. I think what we do have is we also created this a few years ago. We have a professional science masters in space studies, and in that program we have an additional 5 or 6 graduate students who are doing a combination of technical and business classes. They do management, they do entrepreneurship. We have networking events for them, and then we give them they have to do both science and engineering. And the idea is to bring some of those together. And we've been quite lucky with that and we've got one of the few growing professional master's programs in the sciences at Rice. And a lot of our graduates from that program have gone on to work for space companies. In fact, for NASA, we've got quite a few flight controllers as well. I see another question. It looks like it's about. Oh no, wait a minute. Here we go. Mike's responding, so thank you a lot. Yeah, this is an awkward way of doing things, but anyway, we're there. Okay, so this is what we're trying to do in Houston. We have an event coming up, for example, that's a combination of work with an entity we created a few years ago too, called the Technology Collaboration Center. And so we're doing an imaging workshop where we're going to have folks from all 3 of these industries discussing techniques and instrumentation for imaging, whether it be medical imaging, oil and gas exploration, or space imaging. And so these are the kind of things that they take quite a bit of work to get going, but the community is there for it. They just need folks to step up and make the events happen. And that's what the Tech Collaboration Center does. So that's a little bit of backdrop on the Space Institute. Now, what I'm going to try and do with some of these topics that I want to cover is use the moon as a kind of backdrop for it. Obviously, if you pay attention to the news, if you were listening to Jim earlier, the moon is the place to be at the moment. Everybody wants to go to the moon. These are some pictures from the Chinese rover, the Jade Rabbit, and the U2 rover, Chang'e 4 and the U2 rover. But there is since this is homecoming and you're back at Rice, you can't be here without a pop quiz. And I don't know how we're going to answer this. I'm just going to give you a couple of seconds to think about this. And that is, can you name the countries/organizations with a flag on the moon? Some of you may already, if you're really smart, you'll tell me what the missing answer is. Bob, I'll address your question in a second. Okay, so yes, I guess I clicked inadvertently. So I already gave you a clue with China. But obviously the US has been on the moon, so there's a USA flag on the moon. Soviet Union, and specifically Soviet Union, I don't believe Russia has been on the moon since the breakup of the Soviet Union. India, Japan, and China. The European Space Agency has an ESA flag on the moon. And there's one other one that may be unfamiliar to most of you, but hopefully keep you happy about it, and that is Rice University. John Freeman, who unfortunately passed, some of you may know, unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Well, he built one of the, I think this was for Apollo 14. I think he also had instruments going up in Apollo 16. And he bolted a Rice pennant under one of the brackets there. So actually, when historians go up to the moon in the future and they're looking at some of these older historical sites, if they're allowed to touch it and take it apart, they will find a Rice University flag on the moon. So we're part of that illustrious group of people. Now, I was on a meeting a couple of months ago, which the Texas A&M was hosting, and the Chancellor of Texas A&M made a brash plug to get an A&M flag on the moon. So he's pushing, and there's a lot of A&M graduates at John Johnson Space Center. So A&M might be trying to get their flag up on the moon as well at some point. So lobby all your friends to make sure that doesn't happen. Okay, so I want to just jump to the questions again for a second before I move on. Bob, who had a bunch of questions earlier today, he would like to revisit some of the questions that he, unfortunately, there was a lot of questions earlier today and we didn't get to them all. The lunar environment can be fragile, very thin atmosphere to damp out motion of disturbed soil, etc. And he wants to know about resources. So Bob, I'm going to let you ask that later because that's a specific topic I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about cislunar space and particularly lunar resources. And I think your question is very valid. And we do have a speaker in December 8th, who I believe is going to address some of these kind of larger impact issues, not just about the science. But I'll let you ask that later when we get there, if that's fine. And then Remy asked, how do undergraduates get informed about the space science program? On the website, I see information just about the master's program. So typically our space science program is through the physics and astronomy curriculum. So we basically have undergraduates apply to our physics program, physics and astronomy program. We specifically have a BS in physics and a BS, there's some BAs as well, but we also have a BS in astronomy. We don't have a bachelor's degree in space physics. We've talked about trying to add a track, but again, it takes a lot of effort to get the right people together, put the track together. And overall in physics, we don't have a huge population of undergraduates at the moment. And so we need to come up with the right creation. We may have to create new courses, and the student body isn't there to present that. So we do have to do the chicken and egg thing. We have to be able to create the program, advertise it to get the students in, and then teach it. So that's something that we've been discussing. The reason we don't have a bachelor's of science is essentially a legacy issue from the old space physics department. It was mostly a graduate program. And so that had, when the departments merged, that never really translated. This was in 2000. I showed up at Rice in 2003. And this was something that was a bit of a surprise to me too, but it is a legacy issue. And again, one of the most limited resources at Rice is the quality of the people is very high. The limited resource is the number of people. So even though physics and astronomy is one of the largest departments on campus, we're still relatively small, given that we're separated into something like 9 groups compared to our kind of competitors or our peers around the country. So this is a challenge that we always have, and so, but we do have to address that challenge. We're about to engage in another strategic planning activity. We do them every so often, and so this will be a theme there. So, and this is across the board. We're worried about not just the number of graduates coming into our program, number of students coming into our program, but retention and a whole bunch of others. Basically, it's a hard program, and you know that we kind of have a lot of attrition. We're trying to do things to improve that. So I think that was the questions in the Q&A. I don't see any hands up. So let me talk about our students. And this was mentioned, Ryan Odell was mentioned earlier today at Jim's talk. Ryan is the current president of our student organization in the Space Institute. It's our chapter, a fairly new chapter. We created it maybe 3 or 4 years ago, but it really only picked up with essentially Ryan. Ryan has been absolutely fantastic. So SED stands for Students for the Exploration and Development of Space. It was an organization that was started in the late 70s at MIT by a man called Peter Diamandis and some colleagues. And Peter went on to create the Google X Prize, the International Space University, a whole range of stuff. So, and it turns out to be a lot of the people in space right now who are the entrepreneurs basically came through the SEDS activity at whatever university they were in. It's an international organization. Rice is one of the newest chapters. I think there's maybe one or two that have joined since Rice. And Rice basically, the activities of our student, they won chapter of the year last year, and there's a whole range of activities that I want to emphasize because I like to boast about our students. The credit I take is just from being smart enough to recognize the right students, support them, and then stay out of their way. All of the activities I'm about to mention essentially are student design, student run, student organized. The ideas come from there. Our job is to try and support them where we can. And a lot of these pictures kind of show the various levels of activity. But let me just move on to this little block from the bottom. So I'm not going to talk too long about this, but I do want to let you know how much all of this activity that I'm about to talk about and that you're looking at now has happened literally in the last 2 years. Ryan and his colleagues, I'll mention some of the names of the different projects. And what's not listed here is we also have a women in space organization that was just created as part of SEDS just last year. And what I'm not also mentioning is that we have the Rice Eclipse Club, which is a rocket club. And so they've been working on hybrid fuels and competing in rocket competitions. So the one thing that we're really excited about is that hopefully, if things go well, early 2022, we will be launching a satellite. I think my picture is blocking the word. I hope you can see OWLSat-1. Owl, it's surprising to be at a university where the mascot is an owl because that's a hard word for a Scottish person to say. Or it's easy to say, it's just hard for other people to understand it when we say it. So OWLSat-1 was a submission. They actually submitted it to a SEDS competition, and never having done anything like this before and competing against a whole range of folks who've been doing this year in, year out, they got second place. And in that particular competition, only the first place got a flight. But that gave them the confidence to put in for what's called the NASA Cubesat Launch initiative. And they were selected as a group of, I think, of 18. And so they were selected for flight. And so they will be working and building a CubeSat, doing some interesting stuff. And we can talk about it later if anybody's particularly interested. So that's going to be exciting. OWLSat-1 will go up sometime in the early 22 if we get, depending on the manifest and when NASA can give us time on a launch. They're already thinking about OWLSat-2, which they want to be orbiting the moon. So that's really good. And if you jump to number 7 for a second, part of what they're trying to do, they need to raise a certain amount of money to build and develop and buy all the pieces for this CubeSat. And so one of the initiatives that they created was a Send Your Name to Space. And so hopefully, if you're on the alumni list, you've already seen this and you've already sent in your name. And so you can actually, your name will be inscribed, I believe, on a chip that's going to go up with this satellite. So you can actually put your name on the OWLSat-1 spacecraft. So that's one really exciting thing. These guys, from a standing start in a few months to being selected for a space flight, is just absolutely incredible. It tells you the quality of our students, and it's people like Juan de la Garza and I'm getting so nervous with this whiskey now, I'm forgetting half of the names, but Paul Glensky, we've got Feni Pandya is part of this, and Leanne Johnson. I mean, there's lots of folks, graduates and undergraduates in this program, and Doug Steinbach, and a whole bunch of people I'm forgetting. So it's really been great to see. They also created, and again, this is our students creating unique events, having just essentially picked up this mantle of this organization. They have now held 2 and planning their 3rd Owls in Space Symposium, which is essentially a series of panel discussions and industry connections. And so companies will be invited to have a booth to talk to our students. And so we've had, as you can see there, over 500 students. It's not just open to Rice students. We had students from several other universities in Texas, and then a few students from elsewhere around the country, just to see how such an event works. And so again, that was a fantastic thing, and as an accolade for that, they won Rice Program of the Year for 1920. There's a team working on, so again, NASA is putting out a lot of these student challenges. There's a team working on a human-powered rover. So they've got a project that they want to put in for a competition that NASA's running. We have some other students who are working on some habitat technologies, or at least looking for those. And then another team looking about going to, excuse me, to Bob's issue, looking at mining technologies for the moon. So our students, what's been great to see is not only do they have ideas, but now they are really excited. Many of them come to Houston because they think Rice is strongly connected to NASA and they'll get to work with NASA just as part of their everyday schooling. That's not quite where we are just yet, but the fact that they're getting engaged with this kind of organization and they're thinking up these ideas of putting their teaching, their classwork and their innate intelligence and the facilities that Rice provides them into creating and solving some of these problems is absolutely fantastic to watch. Blah, 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 they're doing career fairs and panels. And then again, the SEDS organization hosts the largest student space conference in the world once a year. And again, because of the great work that our students have put in and the level of activity, they won their bid to host Space Vision 2021. So they're already planning for that, and it's being held down at Space Center Houston. So that's going to just be an absolutely fantastic event. So I know it took a bit longer and you didn't hear about space stuff, but you should really be proud of your university, and you should really be proud of the current generation of students too. It's just fantastic to see. And like I said, they're really self-motivated and self-led. And I think, I think I was supposed to, oh, my animation didn't work. Looking for mentors and sponsors. So if you've got time, if you've got money, if you're interested in some of these projects, you can visit seds.rice.edu and you can see what they're up to. And you can help in many different ways. You can get the word out to people. You can mentor them if you have a specific skill set that you'd like to bring to bear on some of their projects, and you can also sponsor them. You can talk to me about that, or you can just talk to the students directly through the website. So anyway, got to put that plug in because, as you know, really in the end, it's all about the money. It's all about being able to do these things. Okay. So the other Rice-related thing, and Jim mentioned this earlier too, is that the very first operational mission with the Spacex Crew Dragon, if many of you follow this, you know that up until August, we were unable to launch US astronauts to the space station from US soil. We've had a great partnership with the Russians. We've been paying Russians anywhere, depending on the where in the program, but up to $80 million a seat to take an astronaut up to the station. That changed in August when SpaceX had their first demo, or actually it's demo 2, but their first demonstration mission to send astronauts to the moon, to the space station, and that was a great successful mission. Bob Behnken and oh man, I can't believe I'm forgetting all these names. But anyway, it's been a long day. But their first official, that was a demonstration mission to show that they could do stuff. These guys were up for a few months. They just came back earlier, I think October. And the next one is the official operational mission, Crew 1. And it will be taking 4 astronauts up, one of which is our very own Shannon Walker. She graduated in 87. She got her master's and her PhD in space physics from Rice, 92, 93. So Shannon will be heading up. They were supposed to go up, I think last week. There was an issue they had to work, and so now they'll be going up sometime in November. And we don't have an official date yet, but that'll be really cool. I'm working on having a live downlink from the space station, connecting schools in Scotland, Houston, and Ecuador. And we're hoping, we've been approved from the educational part. We haven't been approved from the scheduling part yet, but the idea is that we might actually have Shannon and Kate Rubins talk to our students. So that'll be really cool. So I'm really looking forward to getting positive news about that. Okay, space. many different things we can look at. I'm going to kind of focus a little bit on the commercial aspects, what that means in terms of what NASA's doing with the moon, um, and then how that relates to some of this international stuff that's been going on, and then we can get to some of the questions. And this is just I gave this talk I'd mentioned about to the software conference in Scotland. I put this slide together, and I always say that if you see anything that's got the word space and a date on it, either don't believe that it's about space or don't believe the date. Things take time and things get delayed and all sorts of things happen. But I wanted to give a sense that there's a co-development of what you want to do and where you can get to in space, and there's a similar development going on the ground. And these two things are interrelated, partly because of on the technology front, but partly on the fact that many of these terrestrial applications and terrestrial needs will rely in some form or other on some kind of resource in space. Whether it's something fancy like a space-based power, which is out in the longer term, or whether it's just data from a navigation satellite, or the movie of Rice beating Texas from the satellite, the TV satellite. So I just wanted to put that up to show you that, and I've listed a bunch of different things here. This is nowhere near comprehensive, and different people have different ideas about what comes in. Where the focus is now in the commercial world is really on small satellites and their capabilities and the applications of those satellites and constellations of satellites. If you're an astronomer, those constellations are a real pain, but that's where the world is going right now. And so low latency internet around the world is what Elon Musk is pushing through his launches of many, I think now a few hundred of these Cubesat satellites. And there's a whole range of issues there. I'm not going to read to you them. Again, I just wanted to point out that space isn't just about astronauts on the space station or even astronauts on the moon. It's really about how space can benefit humanity on the ground, not just from the point of view of knowledge and learning more about our own solar system and the origins of life in the solar system, but also how it can directly benefit life on Earth, whether it be from developing sustainable technologies, whether it be creating free power in space and beaming it to the Earth, whether it be mining resources on the moon or on asteroids for use on the Earth, or ideally, as Jeff Bezos from Blue Origin and Amazon is looking to, is moving all heavy industry off the Earth so that we live on the Earth and work in space. And so there's all these kind of, some of these things were argued 30, 40, 50 years ago, but now there's actual seriousness to it and there's money going into it. So so that's a good thing there too. Let me see. This is a snapshot of the Artemis program. Again, Jim mentioned the Artemis program. This is NASA's focus right now to put the first woman and the next man on the surface of the moon by 2024, which is a directive given to NASA by the Vice President, who is the chair of the National Space Council. I think many of us think that 24 is not all that realistic. It relies on the Space Launch System going through its green runs and doing all that stuff. It relies on the capsules being ready and so on. However, and this is where I think somebody like Jim Brownstein has been really, really smart, is he hasn't said that's impossible. He said, okay, we'll try and do that. And if you give us the resources we need, I'm sure I can do it. Now, he hasn't got the resources because obviously there's some issues. And of course, we're in a bit of an issue with the economy going forward because of COVID-19 responses. But if you don't target a deadline that's reasonably aggressive, then you just basically slip. So I'm fairly confident that this, if you stretch it out to 28, it will all have happened. Maybe earlier. I think most of us feel that 24 is a little bit too aggressive. But the plan still remains, and they're already working on sending up some of the infrastructure, the human landing systems, one of which is being built here in Houston at Ellington Field at the Houston Spaceport that I'll talk a little bit about. And so the idea is at some time soon, remember I said about dates in space, they will basically get that Artemis system doing its test run. Artemis 1 will be a human-rated spacecraft that will get to the moon and back, not on the surface, but orbiting the moon and back. There will be no humans on board. There will be an uncrewed mission. It will test out all the systems. Shortly thereafter, Artemis 2 will go up with the first human crew, and they will do a lunar orbit, a bit like, I guess it was Apollo 8. And so they will be disappointed. They'll get very close to the moon, but they won't be able to land. And then there'll be a number of support infrastructure launches to get the materiel up there for use by the actual crew that's going to land on the moon. And so that's still a little bit of flux. There's an idea for this thing called the Gateway, which is an orbiting platform there, which will be a kind of transit station for astronauts. They will take one spacecraft up to the Gateway, transition to a landing craft and come down, and then there'll be an ascent craft to go back to Gateway and so on. And the idea behind all of this is that if you do it properly, it's not just about footprints and flags on the moon. We already have footprints there. We already have an American flag. It's about a sustainable presence and what we do with that presence and how we utilize that presence. And so creating this kind of infrastructure and how we work it. The Space Launch System will be doing the human part, but people like SpaceX and a few other companies will be doing the logistics part. The Falcon 9s and the Falcon 9 Heavies will be taking up material for use by the astronauts either on the surface or in orbit of the moon. And so this, again, you can look up much more detail about this, but this is what's happening and this is what's driving a lot of the conversation currently. And then ultimately what we learn here and what we do here and so on will prepare us for going on to Mars sometime. Jim said mid 2030s. Let's just go with that. I think that's a good target to aim for. And I was going to show this video, but it turns out it's a little bit awkward to jump to YouTube. But one of the things that's going to make this moon thing happen is something that was started by President George W. Bush and then was expanded by President Obama. And that is how NASA partners with the commercial entities. And of course, one of the famous ones that probably everybody's heard of by now is SpaceX with Elon Musk. And I have to tell you, if you go and look at this movie, which is just Google double landing SpaceX, this is one of the coolest space movies I've ever seen. And I've seen Armageddon, right? But no, but this is just these are first stage boosters that launched satellites and came back. And not only did they come back, but they came back together. And this was just, and I think, I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think SpaceX has now had 56 flights or 50 plus flights where they've brought back the booster. As you know, when you send something into space, you burn up all the fuel and you junk everything else except the thing you're putting in space. So, you know, the boosters become, they either fall back and burn up in the atmosphere, or worse, they become a large chunk of space debris for other missions to worry about. And then the second stage and so on, everything just goes. Well, that's starting to change. And if that changes, then the cost to space comes way down. Not because you're saving that much money, it's a few, maybe $16, $20 million on the booster, but your turnaround time is now, could be potentially days instead of months. This is the problem with the shuttle, which is a reusable vehicle. The turnaround time was several months, and so they were only getting a few flights a year. And the refurbishment after each mission was really expensive. So it really became, it was a great machine, but it was really not economical. Elon Musk and a few other companies are doing this reusability issues like Blue Origin. They are changing that dynamic, and hopefully the cost of space can come down even by as much as a factor of 10, from $10,000, $15,000 per pound down to the $1,000 or less dollars per pound. And that's a big game changer. It opens up, we call it the democratization of space, but really it's just the opening up of space to many different players, whether it be companies, small universities, a whole range of different opportunities will open up from that. So I encourage you to look at that movie, it's pretty cool. They're also building Starship. Elon has some great ideas that he makes work, and then he has some crazy ideas that I don't think will work, but he's proved everybody wrong so far. So he's working on Starship in Texas. And let me just see, I've got a couple of questions. And I'm presuming since you don't put your hand up, you just want me to read them. So Kathy Wyman is asking about any thoughts about Virgin Orbit's efforts. I know they had a failure in the summer. Sounds like they're going to try again in December. So yeah, I wish I had time to really talk about all of the activity that's going on. And Virgin Galactic was one of the early adopters, if you like, of the concept of space tourism. And so they developed a means of getting a spacecraft to space, which was essentially Spaceship Two hanging from the White Knight spacecraft, a large wide-body aircraft that could carry this spaceship sort of underneath its fuselage and drop it, and then it becomes a rocket engine to go into space. And as a result of that technology development, they also saw that in the short term anyway, the bulk of I think the bulk of the market is going to be in the small satellite launch. So they basically spun out this new company called Virgin Orbit. And the idea of Virgin Orbit is instead of a nice little passenger plane, jet plane that you carry in your large aircraft to altitude and then let it go, you basically carry a rocket. And then that rocket, you take it up to altitude and you do the heavy lifting with a reusable craft, and then it will take small satellites up into space. Yes, they had a failure just recently. I think that was a bit of a drawback. Unfortunately, I think we say this maybe too often, but space is hard. And the way that just to go back to SpaceX for a second, I don't have shares in SpaceX, by the way. They just happen to be the more well known. That's why I mention them so much. But SpaceX basically just flies things they try things until they fail, and then they work out why they failed, and then fix it, and then fly again until it blows up, and so on. And so that's been their model. It's not really been Virgin's model, but they understand that they're essentially in the test phase right now. And this is what it takes. You have to do your burns. You have to test that you're doing all the right things, that when you shake stuff, that the bolts aren't going to fly out. And so you have to test, and as long as you're doing it, transparently in a sense, and that you're telling everybody you're testing, I don't think a failure is a big deal. The danger is when you tell everybody everything's good, and then you lose a $1 billion satellite because things weren't good. That can happen even with the best of systems. But anyway, so they're going about it the right way. They'll learn from the mistakes and they'll move on. So and they've been quite aggressively marketing Virgin Orbit. They've even signed a deal with a potential spaceport in the UK and Newquay in Cornwall. I hope that answers your question, Kathy, at least to some extent. And then Rich Moore is asking, can you comment on the NASA emphasis on putting humans in space with the associated cost complications versus using robot exploration? With limited funds, does sending humans make sense? My thoughts. And that is a perennial question, Rich, and it's a really, really good question. I did, if you want what do you call it? If you want a shameless plug, if you go back to Houston TEDx talks or TEDx Houston talks in 2015, I gave a talk on this very thing. And the basic theme with humans, there's two things that I promote when it comes to human spaceflight. First of all, you're perfectly correct. It typically costs anywhere from 3 to 10 times as much when there's a human involved, because you can't just basically have an unpressurized cabin, so then you have to pressurize the cabin. Then you have to have life support systems, which are technically very fragile. Then you have to have resources for those humans to survive, whether it be food, water, all of those different things, medical worries with microgravity. So yeah, humans are are very fragile beings, and space doesn't want them, right? There's no atmosphere, there's a lot of radiation, lack of gravity messes with you. But I think that the two main people push the idea of the species surviving, and we're explorers. All of those things are really, really good, but I think there there's a couple of practical benefits that I think I like to emphasize. Before I say that, robots, of course, can do a certain amount of science, and they're a lot cheaper. And if they blow up, very few people outside of JPL care, Jet Propulsion Lab. But the Spirit and Opportunity rovers, which are those two little go-kart type rovers that were sent up, in about 10 years, they did a lot of science, but a human could have done the same science in a week, right? So a lot of it depends on what you're doing and how you're going to go about it and what the risks and the cost benefits are, right? So those are very important questions. The two things I think are really important. One is that if you are solving a technology for a human, let's say you want to send a human to Mars, that human has to survive 500 days at least. And so you have to create, and they have to survive essentially in a tin can, maybe a large tin can, but they have to survive in a tin can for 5 years. And so the technology you develop to keep that human alive and to keep the systems working, you can't just send 5 years worth of water and 5 years worth of all this sort of thing. Those technologies directly benefit humans on the ground because the technologies are developed for humans. And so so the theme of that TEDx talk was the humans inspire humans, but a human in the loop, that technology development. I always say that there's 4 people going to Mars sometime in the next 40 years. That is not a market. But the technologies that get developed can then be applied to 7.5 billion people on the planet. Whether it be water reclamation technologies that we're going to really need, especially with climate change, and the kind of RICE has actually got a center for looking at cleaning water and so on using nanotechnology. Those are things that can overlap. If you have power technologies where you can't just take a lot of batteries, so you're developing more efficient solar panels or other means of powering your system. If you are looking at health technologies where an astronaut who is not a doctor can monitor their health, record their vitals, do simple surgeries and so on their crewmates, maybe involving telerobotic surgeries, all of those developments can be transformed into what we do on the ground with healthcare issues for people who are in rural communities or in developing countries, for example. And I said this to a doctor one time about, like the village in Africa is going to need some of this. And he was based in a hospital in London. And he said, actually, we need it in London because if you think of big cities, if you are a chronically ill person, a visit to the doctor is a day-long activity, and you might have to have, your husband or wife or your son or daughter take the day off work, come and prepare you for the doctor, take you to the doctor, have a 30-minute visit for the doctor, say, well, you're looking pretty good, I'll see you next month, and then go back home. If you could do much of that from the house so that that person can telecommunicate with their doctor and have all that information because the technology is there for that person who's not an expert, who doesn't know the scientist or a doctor, but knows how to work relatively simple devices, and those devices are accurate and secure, of course. These are things that are being developed because we're trying to send humans to Mars. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing I already alluded to was humans inspire humans. I think if one of the biggest technologies or one of the biggest benefits to come out of Apollo was not, well, obviously it wasn't Tang and Velcro or anything like that, but it wasn't the technologies, the microcomputers, all those things were really important. But the biggest thing that came out was the number of people who wanted to become scientists, engineers, and astronauts. And that changed the whole dynamic of the US educational system. And it made the US economy what it is today. The US became the technological lead because of the inspiration of sending people to the moon. And I believe that when you've got a human going to Mars, that there's a direct connection between everybody on the planet and that person because it's another human being. And I think that inspiration will tell us a lot about ourselves and will also encourage that next generation of smart people who want to improve society and improve the world. If you look at people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, how did they make their money? On computers, on the internet. That would never have happened if it wasn't for them being inspired by this. And then once they made their money, they've turned to space. So I think there's those two main reasons for why it's important to send humans. It lets us know that it's doable. It lets us know that humans can do what they put their mind to. It develops technologies that will benefit society ultimately. And yeah, you know, we'll have a footprint on Mars, and we'll get some really good science, and there'll be some stuff we do. And that's part of the whole picture. But those are the two things that I think are most important. So I was saying earlier that Jim Brownstein talks a lot, I think, about Dunham here. So I hope that answers your question, Rich. And I'm already at 7:30, and I'm not even going anywhere where I want to go. So the conversation is what we should be. N. Bailey, I don't know first name, tried to get the YouTube video. It didn't work. Can you send the link? You mean for the do you mean for the geo landing? If you mean, and I can't cut and paste at the moment, but if it's for the geo landing, if you Google double landing SpaceX, you will find it. If it's for the TEDx talk, you just do TEDx Houston 2015 and you'll find it. I was the first speaker, so I should pop up there. So I hope that answers your question, N. Bailey. Okay, so let me move along. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but one of the things you see, SpaceX is kind of the kind of top dog in terms of awareness of people out there for the commercial enterprise. NASA's working with them. But this is just telling you there's now companies who are watching, people who advise people on investments, and they've started to see the huge growth of venture capital funding and investment funding into the space world. And so this is just one snapshot from a company called Bryce Space and Technology, who do these annual reports, in fact, monthly reports in some cases. And most of this is being driven by satellites that are essentially remote sensing the Earth. In other words, navigation, mapping, precision agriculture, monitoring shipping traffic, all these different things. And that's been supported by launch to low Earth orbit and the operations of those missions, and particularly a growing interest in small satellites. Satellites, we call them Cubesats, that are about the size of a small tissue box that you might have on your bathroom sink, 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters, and the increase in capability in those kind of small platforms. And remember, if it's $10,000 per pound, these things typically only weigh about 7 pounds. So that's a lot cheaper than a 200 kilogram satellite, for example. So there's a growth in that market, and particularly the biggest part of that growth is in the services that these space resources provide. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's an increased investment going on. There's another chart. You can see that space is not just about space. There's data, there's a launch market, of course. There's actually people talking about building stuff in space. There's what you do downstream, downlinking information, analyzing data from around the world, and so on. So you can kind of look at this, and even beyond Earth, there's some ideas out there for what we do when we're on the moon and beyond. So again, this is just a changing face. There's a lot more investment going into space. There's a lot more innovative ideas, and actually kind of out there ideas that are coming up. I think are proving to be quite important. And then to support that, there's an increasing growth in commercial launch sites and commercial spaceports. This is a map that you can't read anything on it, but you just need to look at the number of dots. Some of these are things like Cape Canaveral in Florida, but a lot of those dots are commercial entities that are not necessarily launching anybody yet, but they have big plans to do so. And we have actually one right here in Houston, down at Ellington Field, which is relatively close to NASA. It is where NASA astronauts flew, and they still have a fleet of T-38s. So the astronauts did their flight training there. They have Texas Army Reserve, so they've got a suite of Apache helicopters. The Flight Museum from Galveston, after I can't remember which hurricane it was, relocated to Ellington Field. And so the city has been investing. There's a license now for horizontal launches. And there's a growth in the development. The city's invested close to, I think, $70 million overall on this site. And we've been working at Rice and various other places with the Houston Spaceport project. And up until COVID, things were on a really rapid track. Things have slowed down a little bit as companies who were hoping to come to Ellington Field have to reconsider some of their investments and so on. But this is a really exciting project. And one of the long-term goals is point-to-point transportation. Where you actually can do maybe hypersonic or even, well, hypersonic for sure, but space flight from one point on the Earth to another point on the Earth, so that you can travel the world, destination to destination in a few hours. So that's long-term goal. But in the meantime, we're building up short-term goals from the educational perspective, and also from we're building a lunar lander. A company called Intuitive Machines is building one of the early Lunar Lander, the kind of cargo suppliers to the moon. That's being built today. A company called Axiom Space, which just got the first $330 million contract to build a commercial space station, will be locating, or there's discussions about locating here. I'm not sure if they've made that decision yet or not. So we've got a lot of this going on, and Rice and Rice Space Institute are involved in this. And I know I'm taking a lot of time. So one of the reasons for starting to think about all this infrastructure, and this is a conversation that's going on that might come back to Bob's question, and that is what we call the cislunar infrastructure. We've had a number of discussions about this. It's been led by the United Launch Alliance, which is a joint company between Boeing and Lockheed Martin. And the idea there is to basically have a space-based infrastructure in what we call cislunar space, which essentially is Earth orbit, the space between the Earth and the moon orbit, and the surface of the moon. And so the large-scale goals of this, perhaps just to give you one example in the interest of time, is that you might mine water from the moon, turn that water into, or keep it as water, make sure that it's purified, or use sunlight to break it up into hydrogen and oxygen, both of which are rocket fuels. You can maybe use the oxygen for habitats if you happen to have humans on the surface. But then you ship that material up into essentially a big gas station, and you store all of that material. So then you've got a mission coming from the Earth that may be on its way to Mars, or it may be on its way to an asteroid. And instead of launching with all of the fuel it needs, which is, again, the cost of launch, it basically rendezvous with the gas station at the moon, refuels, and of course it's cheaper to get that fuel up from the lower gravity of the moon than it is from the Earth. You refuel from there, and then you go off on your trip. You could be mining other resources that may be of use. In fact, I think the Chinese have big plans for helium-3. We need a fusion reactor that can use that helium-3, but there's a lot of helium-3 on the surface of the moon coming from the solar wind. And so there's all these big ideas for the next 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years going out. You have these constant, solar electric propulsion is a very, very slow propulsion mechanism. But if you've got a continuous transport system, so a series of tugs, the speed doesn't matter. It's just logistics at that point. You're just, when do I need my bacon sandwiches at the moon? You backtrack to when you have to launch it. And so you just have this continuous transportation system. So there's big discussions around this, all about that connection to the moon. And the way it's going to work for commercial companies, at least in the short term, is if they have a large government anchor tenant. And that, at the moment, for the US companies, that will be NASA. NASA will want that fuel. They've already given them a price point. They've already given them a sense of how much fuel they might want. Now it's up to the companies to see if they can process and mine that water from the moon economically. And a lot of companies have done the calculations, suggest, especially if they have NASA as a guaranteed customer, that they could break even within 10 years. And then basically everything after that is just profit. And we're talking, we frequently refer to this now as the $1 trillion economy. And so all of this stuff is what's in active consideration just now, above and beyond NASA's plans for the moon. So again, Bob, this might be a time to ask you a question, but let me stop at this and let Bob. Do you want to ask it in person? Bob, I'm going to give you the voice, and you can say no if you want. But I'm sort of getting tired of just listening to myself here. So um, there's a Rob. I'm looking for Bob. There's Bob. So Bob, you can talk now if you would like.
Okay, David,
Good,
first
good,
of all,
good.
terrific talk and a great talk earlier today from Bridenstine. I think NASA's in great hands with him as an administrator, and I hope that continues, whoever ends up with the next administration. Um, of course, as scientists, we're sort of focused on the science rather than perhaps extracting something that can be sold from the moon. But there's a real concern here about the lunar environment because it's a very thin atmosphere. It'd be considered a hard vacuum on the Earth, but it's a very interesting sort of prototype planetary atmosphere. And then you've got charging mechanisms, photoelectrons being ejected from the surface, and the solar wind impacting the surface. And then as you circulate through the Earth's magnetosphere, the plasma environment changes, and thus the electric potential at the moon changes. And so there's a lot going on dynamically there. But if you start, say, strip mining the surface of the moon, you could have a real mess up there. And those particles can bounce way across the surface of the moon. And on the Earth, when you stir up dust, you grade a field or whatever you do, the Earth's atmosphere tends to damp it out within perhaps a fraction of a mile. But on the moon, things could go for some distance. And then, of course, there could be a potential dust problem. You would like to have these telescopes up there that you were talking about, looking out from the far side of the moon. It would be, there's lots of terrifically exciting science, but you don't want to create an environment where you can't do that anymore. So I think this is a really important issue. And something that Rice is well equipped to deal with because it's a matter of physics, it's a matter of geology and geochemistry, and Rice is well equipped to deal with that. And I'd just be interested in your comments on that if you wish to.
No, and I think you're right. And as I said, I mentioned that we have a regular RSI Houston Spaceport Frontier Lecture program. Pretty much we have a talk once a month during the fall and spring semesters. Our next one happens to be on November 5th, which is an astronaut and doctor who will be talking. But in December 8th, we have a woman from Arizona State University, Tima Agranabi, I think her name is, Timi Agranabi, and she is more on the why do this to the moon kind of, not on the science side, but just talking about the larger implications of all these companies and all these countries racing to the moon to dig it up. So it is an active conversation. There's a thing that if I get time to, I'll get to the Artemis Accords, which is how NASA's trying to address some of these issues. But you are correct. The saving grace, at least in the short term, is that the only viable location for doing a lot of these things is in the South Pole. And the South Pole geologically is a very interesting region, so don't get me wrong about that. But one of the things is, if the reason for doing this, for non-science, just for not for science at the moment, is access to resources. And the key resource at the moment that's relatively easy, and I say relatively as you can imagine, you're working in temperatures that are significantly below freezing, so we don't even know if our machines will work there. And that is water. And most of the water that we are pretty sure is there, we know there's a lot of water there. We've detected it via neutrons and other signs of hydrogen that are present, are in these permanently shaded regions. So they don't get a chance, the water has never had a chance to sublimate. And there's a number of these permanently shaded regions around the moon, most notably at the poles, because of the way because it's tidally locked with the Earth, the angle of the moon is almost straight up and down. And so you get these, the sun is always like on the horizon near the poles. There's no seasons like we have here on the Earth with a tilt. And And so you have, so that's where you're kind of located for the resources. Well, now you have to get to the resources, so you need power. Well, a nighttime on the moon is 2 weeks. So you basically need to have really, really good batteries where you can charge for 2 weeks and then run off them for 2 weeks. Or you go to locations where you have as much sunlight as possible. And it turns out that is also at the poles. And so we have these peaks of eternal light down in the South Pole, where there are locations there that get close to 97% sunlight year round. It's just to do with angles and all sorts of stuff. So what that will do in the short term, until technologies get much better, is limit all of these activities to the South Pole for the most part, maybe to some extent the North Pole. How that affects everything else, again, if the level activity picks up, then I don't think we can avoid it. And so one of the things that people are talking about are kind of safe zones. And also, if you're looking for humans who might want to do geology and rove, take the rover and go somewhere, it's a long way from the South Pole to other places on the moon where you might have interesting geologies. You would definitely, for instance, one of the big discussions for an observatory is a radio observatory on the far side of the moon, so that you get no radio interference coming from the Earth. And that will be closer, I think, probably up to near the equator. So you're going to have the 2 weeks night, 2 weeks day type of issues, but at least you will have a clean environment for radio astronomy. What happens with the dust particles and how that affects your ability to do anything, science or even development, is something that they're going to have to worry about. Not only is it because of the light gravity where it can go for a long time, at least there's no weather, so there's no wind systems and so on, but these things can, as you say, can bounce around and they can pick up some electric charge and move somewhere else and so on. The other thing for that too is that because there's no atmosphere on the moon, the regolith, the dust on the moon, has been pounded by solar wind particles, in other words, protons, for billions of years. And so it's really, really fine. And so that causes a huge amount of problems, because it's not like dust on Mars where you can just basically take a squeegee and clean your solar panels. There are things you're going to have to deal with. It could be potentially toxic because it's so small, and so you don't want astronauts breathing it in and so on. So I think we're at the very early stages here of what can be done. And the worst case scenario is basically we essentially destroy the moon because it just becomes a big industrial site. And that's, I'm not saying that glibly, and we're talking a few hundred years here, but the issue there then is, how would that, such a worst case, terrible situation, balance against removing all of that stuff from the Earth, and so that the Earth becomes a place to live and the moon becomes a place to work. And those are conversations that are starting now, because even now, and maybe I'll just finish with this, because this was what I was going to go on and talk to, and I think we're already losing people because we're way over time, but the US is basically saying, oh, US companies, you can go up and you can dig up a chunk of gold on the moon. There won't be gold on the moon, but you can dig up something valuable on the moon and you can bring it back and sell it. And that's how you make your money. And we'll buy it. Not only that, we'll buy it from you because we really need that. Well, then the Space Treaty of 1967 says, well, wait a minute, nobody can own the moon. Well, we're not talking about the moon, we're talking about part of it. And so now there's discussions about, well, any money that gets made from resources on the moon should be evenly spread around the world, so that poor countries who don't have the ability to go up and dig up their own water or their own helium-3 or whatever benefits from the fact that they, quote, own some of this property as a human being. And so these are discussions. The Space Act that protects all of this is essentially out of date, because they had not envisaged the rise of the commercial aspects of this. And so that's something that is definitely going to have to be addressed. NASA has started to address it by trying to update it through what they call the Artemis Accords. A lot of people are balking at that because, of course, it's America doing it, and since America is doing it in their own self-interest and so on. And NASA, Mike Gold is the guy at NASA who's been pushing this, have been very, very careful to try and bring everybody on board that they can, stay true to the basic tenets of the space treaty, but acknowledge the new kind of world that we're living in at the moment. So these are very, very hard conversations. I'm afraid what I'm worried about is that the scientists will have the least say. You just have to look at what Elon Musk is doing with these constellations and these, these huge. You can look up almost any night now and see a big string of bright objects. And if you're an astronomer, that's not a good thing. But if we participate in the conversations, and Rice and other universities participate in these conversations, there might be some kind of accommodation where there are no-go zones. And we can actually have people or robots doing the research, either the observing for astrophysics and astronomy, or the geology and the kind of planetary sciences that we might want to do, on the surface. We're even talking with companies about something that we're developing at Rice that might be able to identify different mineral types, not necessarily for mining, but for geology. So you can do it non-invasively, for example. So these are important questions that you're asking, Bob, and I think they are there. And just on a Monday, you focus on, hey, we're going to mine water on the moon, and then on a Tuesday, we're going to talk about doing radio astronomy from the far side, etc. And at some point, all of these conversations are going to have to come together. So I kind of hope that addresses your question a little bit. I'm sorry it's not complete, but. And I see Kate coming on, which means it's time to go, I think. So
it is. So I appreciate everyone for staying on as long as they have. David, I have one last question for you that I have to ask because you brought up Armageddon. What is your favorite space movie?
Actually, my favorite, I think I would rather not pick a movie. I want to pick a TV series.
Okay, perfect.
There's a TV series called The Expanse, which was originally on the Sci-Fi Channel, and then Amazon bought it out. And so the last season, maybe the last 2 seasons were on Amazon. Season 5 starts filming December 15th. And the nice thing about The Expanse, there's a whole bunch of drama and all that sort of stuff that you might expect from a good TV series, but it has a lot of the science down. And so there's people who are terraforming Mars, and instead of it happening in a month, it happens over hundreds of years. And so the Martians are living underground, and they've developed, and because it was populated by all the best scientists, they're small, but they have the best technology, and Earth is huge. And so there's a little but there's a little tension going on there. And then there's the people who go out to the asteroid belt and mine the asteroids. And those are called the Belters, and they want their own independence because they're the kind of, like the navvies, the Irish navvies that came over and built the railroads. They were just kind of workers for pennies. And they have got interest. They tend to be tall and thin because they've grown up and raised in essentially zero gravity. And so there's a lot of really interesting stuff in that. They've got farms on Ganymede. So it's just really interesting. So if you get a chance to watch The Expanse,
now I'm adding it to my queue right now. I've never even heard of it. I'm so excited.
I like it. There's some good characters on it, and anyway, so yeah, so that's what I would like. But I'll watch any science fiction movie. Armageddon's not actually the best movie, but
it's not the best, but it really pulls at your heartstrings,
Right. Well, I actually there was another series called Away that they've just cancelled. I didn't like it in the first episode, but it kind of grew on me, and it was about humans going to Mars and the dynamic on that long trip and stuff. Yeah, there's I don't know if there's a science fiction film I haven't, like Killer Clowns from Outer Space wasn't very good. But anyway, so I don't know. There's I think if they do it right, there's a lot of really good things out there, and
yeah,
doing it right depends on who you are. I know for instance, Gravity, the movie Gravity.
Yeah.
Physicists hated it, and the astronauts loved it. And the astronauts loved it because they did a really good job at replicating the station, replicating the tools. Mike Massimino is a friend of mine. He was a Hubble repair guy. one of the tools that Sandra Bullock uses is he said, that looks like one I used. I mean, they've really copied that. The fact that she was flying between space stations using a fire extinguisher, that's what got the physicists kind of mad. So anyway.
Yeah. I think that's what got a lot of us being like, I'm not sure.
Well, anyway, there's a lot of good stuff. So again, I'm sorry for rabbiting on so much, but it's the trouble with us who are really into the space stuff is we're really into the space stuff.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say things in 2-second bites. So
no need to apologize. This was great. I'm glad that you went on and on. I think it was great.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you everybody for your time. And you know how to find us, rsi.rice.edu, and look for these talks that we have. Some really good talks coming up. And if you want to get engaged with our students, please do so.
Thank you so much, David. We so appreciate you being here. And thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you have a great night.
Thanks, Kate.